it over to George to give us some great content.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. And also, I just want to verify, you can hear me okay, Bill?
Yep, yeah, we can hear you
Okay, great.
perfect.
And can you see my screen?
Yep, yep,
Okay,
we can
great.
see.
Yeah. So this is not going to be like the Mary Meeker presentation where she does 200 slides in 20 minutes. But what I want to do is, give a kind of a short prezzo, probably only about 10 or 15 minutes. And what my goal is for this audience is to give you a context of, what's the macro environment, what's happening overall in the world economically and otherwise. And separately, what does it mean for us in terms of capital for developing companies and entrepreneurs? And to think about how do we go forward in this Corona environment with a business where the economy's in a weird state, and what sectors are going to be really good, what are not. So I'm just going to go into this, and some parts will go pretty fast, others I'll expand on more. And again, our goal is to have a fairly lively interaction at the end of this. So write down questions as we go through this for conversation at the end. So this is probably apparent to a lot of you, but I'm just going to recap. We're at an unusual place where the economy is at a near standstill with the record unemployment in excess of 20%. We have an uncertain path to normalization and an unknown recovery time. When I talk about normalization and recovery, it's in two ways. One is at what point do we get a handle on COVID in terms of vaccines and treatments? And separately, how do we get the economy kickstarted again once that is happening? And how do we reopen? The other thing is that it is a reality that new capital is always scarce in these times, just by nature of, I would say, fear and anxiety in the investor arena. But I do want to also mention that, especially when I talk to younger entrepreneurs, typically under 35 years old, because of my ancient age, I started in medieval times in startups, and I've been through probably 5 or 6 cycles, and I really believe that the U.S. is very resilient, and it's reinvented itself again and again over the years. So I do think there will be light at the end of the tunnel. So the real issue for us as entrepreneurs is, how do we get through the near term, which is the next 24 months or thereabouts, and then what's beyond that? But it is certain that there will be a good outcome for us, and I really believe that. So what next? This is a typical face of an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley today, and it's been that way for quite a while. I think the most important thing for any company is just focus on surviving until the economy picks up again. And probably the number one rule is conserving cash. That is the absolute number one rule, because we really don't know, but it's probably 12 to 24 months before things really start to pick up and getting momentum. And I've talked to CEOs around the world over the last couple of months, and I think the most important thing is that, and people have already done this mostly, but to take deep cost cuts, however painful, that would be reducing staff, taking pay cuts, whatever. But I think that's been very necessary. Also, I think notwithstanding our government's efficiency, trying to take advantage of things like the PPP and other government-sponsored relief has been advantageous. That's been a kind of a confusing thing, but hopefully people will get the advantage of that over time. I think most importantly is maximizing the runway and just ensuring staying power. And I think the number one rule of any company is just survive the near term, because good things will happen. But I think it is painful right now. But again, cash is king, and you've got to survive in the near term. I want to talk about capital. That's something that I'm asked about all the time in Silicon Valley. And this is a very pretty depiction of what the capital markets are like right now. That's a VC going down there. So the commentary is that, and probably most of you know this, but new capital is very, very scarce these days. And it's just the normal human reaction, which is to tighten up and slow down when there's uncertainty. and when there's fear. And so in terms of capital, bank lending is pretty limited from traditional sources, except for these government programs that are out there. The angels who typically funded, the early stage companies, most of them are on pause. And the primary reason is that, when there's fear and uncertainty, especially with your personal pocketbook, people tend to pull back and just wait and see what happens. The venture firms, what they have been doing, and this is pretty typical in any uncertainty, is they're circling the wagons. And what that means is they're really not doing any new investments, but they tend to split their portfolio through a triage into those firms that they think will survive, and to support them and put more money into those companies. Separately, they have cast off where they think there's no chance for whatever reason, and they are just setting them aside, and they're probably going to let them die. PE firms also are triaging their portfolios in the same way, supporting companies that they think will make it, and also dumping companies that won't. The other nuance with PE firms is that, for those of you who are familiar with the model, that they typically use a lot of debt leverage into their companies. And so there's an unusual source of stress for some PE firms where they've taken on too much debt for companies. And an example would be where they went into there was a company that, a PE firm that went huge into the hotel industry and took on a lot of debt. And so the combination of the fading of the hotel industry for the near term with the huge debt burden is really, really a problematic situation. But in summary, there's limited new capital available. I would say that it doesn't mean you can't find it somewhere, but just the normal rules have been suspended. And the main thing I would say about capital is that it's just the near term that it'll slow down. But as we go 12 to 24 months, I think it'll free up and be available. I want to talk about going forward, and how to think about your company in this environment. Probably everybody in this call is too young. Does it, I don't know if people know, Angus MacGyver was a big 1980s show, but the guy would always get into these impossible situations no matter what. He was kind of a adventurer and kind of fix-it guy. And so he would get in these impossible situations, and somehow he would have like a Swiss Army knife in his pocket, and he would do things like build a rocket ship in 5 minutes and save the world, or things like that. He would skydive and create a parachute out of a paper napkin or something like that. But he's kind of a hero to me because he was always adapting and improvising. And so kind of thematically, what I would say is that for all emerging companies and entrepreneurial companies, I think number one, you've got to survive. That's the number one thing. And the other thing is, I think you have to start thinking about adapting and improvising your business to cope with the current condition of the economy. And so with that in mind, I think that one has to think about either pivoting, even acquiring, or merging. To just elaborate, in terms of pivoting, to think of new cases for your current products, different ways they might be used, or creating new products or services from the assets and IP that you have. Another thought process is going into new geographic markets. So for example, going into a different part of the US, going into Europe, Asia, a market that you haven't tapped before, or even a new segment. So for example, if you are a enterprise-based offering, maybe go down to mid-market or small business or something like that. Another thing to think about also is new sales strategies. There are different paths, but expanding into things, whether it be direct sales channels or partnerships, depending on what one is doing presently. The other thing is that it's opportunistic, but there may be competitors that you know very well who, for one reason or another, are not strong enough to make it on their own. And you could go out there and acquire them, and that would accomplish two things. One is maybe pick up new products or new markets, new talent, and also just a stronger combined entity with the combined cash and other resources and assets of the company. Um, the other thing too is that for some companies, it may make sense to merge into a competitor and to be acquired, and to carry forward the product, as part of a bigger company. So I think the main thing I would say is that one has to be thinking about what the current offering is, and how to rapidly evolve it to deal with the current circumstances, in order to create new revenue sources as you go through this period. I want to just give a number of interesting examples of, let's call them pivots. So, on the upper left, you see, sorry, let me just, that's an insignia for Apollo 13, which was a famous capsule in 1970 going to the moon. What happened was the astronauts were out in orbit, and their air system failed. And the air system did two things. One is that it removed, I think it was carbon monoxide out of the exhaust. And the other thing is it kept a constant flow of oxygen coming into the capsule. So anyway, it failed, but they were several thousand miles away from Houston, and on their own, basically. So what ended up happening, and this is an example of a MacGyver situation, the flight crew in Houston was locked in a room. There were about 20 engineers locked in a room, and the supervisor came in and brought in a box and said, "This is everything that the capsule has and the astronauts have in their room, and we have to come up with a solution using only things that are in that capsule." So at any rate, they were locked in the room for about 36 hours, and they basically were able to cut and tape together kind of a makeshift fix on the system with supplies that they knew were in the capsule. They radioed that to the astronauts, and the astronauts successfully installed that and made it safely back to Earth. So that's an example of a MacGyver situation where they took what was in there and just rejiggered it. Slack, is very famous now. I don't know if everyone knows it, but they started out as a gaming video company that was online, and they spent millions of dollars on this gaming video thing, which basically got no revenues and no traction, and essentially failed. However, they had built this internal messaging and communication platform for the engineering and development team to work on the code. And they ended up marketing that for other companies to use as an internal communication platform. And that's where Slack came from. So the original model failed completely, but they built this great communication thing. Industrious, I don't know how many people know it, but everyone knows WeWork. And so, WeWork obviously is just a huge flaming ball right now. But Industrious is a company in kind of it used to be in the same sector as WeWork. But what they ended up doing several years ago was they said, we don't want to be in the business of buying or leasing property and then subdividing that for use by our customer base. We don't want to be in the real estate business. So in contrast to WeWork, what they said was, we're going to go to landlords and property managers and offer to create an environment for their lessees where everyone wants to come in and use the space. So what was very clever about what Industrious did was they took themselves out of the real estate business, and in the same way that Marriott does hotel management without owning hotels, Industrious did the same thing for workspace, and they've done that very successfully. And it's a contrast to WeWork. On the left side, there's a company called Cheetah, which is based here in Silicon Valley. And they were formed several years ago for this brilliant idea of supplying restaurants with supplies. And obviously, this isn't a good time for supplying restaurants, especially the last several months. And so it's been a hard time for them. However, what they ended up doing recently was they pivoted where they use their capabilities logistically, where they're now selling bulk products of food supplies to consumers. And what they do is they have pickup points in shopping malls or parking lots. And so they actually sell bulk supplies of food to consumers. And they went from restaurant supplies to that just to keep going. Just two more on this. YouTube was actually originally thought of as a dating site. And it turned out that there was more interest in watching videos rather than the dating side of it. And that's how YouTube really started to emerge. And then Yelp was originally supposed to be a restaurant referral kind of business where you refer to friends to go to restaurants. And then it evolved into this huge rating system along with an advertising model and very successfully went forward. The last one I'll mention is Online Resources. And this is a company I took public in the late 90s. It was an internet banking company. But I went there in the early 90s, and the founder was this crazy Harvard MBA former bank executive, and he carried around this little phone with him. And the phone was it had a little LCD on the receiver, and so you could use a modem, if you can believe it, to dial in to a bank line and then use the LCD kind of like it looked like an ATM LCD where you could then transfer money or pay checks using this modem phone. And the founder would proudly carry around this clay model as we raised money. And anyway, it was very, very archaic. We had to beat him into submission, and then we went to a computer-based banking application, and then ultimately an internet capability, and then went public with JP Morgan back in the 90s. But what was funny was, though, he used to proudly carry around this phone on his desk, and I still have one of those. And but anyway, it's an example of evolution. So just to pause for a minute, I think the main point is that most companies actually are not what they start out to be, and they keep on evolving and iterating until they find something that can monetize and generate revenues and go forward. And so in these times in particular, I think it's a good opportunity to say, okay, what works and what doesn't work. I'll just give one last mundane example. HP has been around for a long time and was always thought of as a technology company. And as often happens with big companies, it's stagnated over the years. But I think there's one irony now, which is that HP makes most of its money on printer cartridges. So they used to be technology and tubes and all this other stuff. And then they got into printers in the 1980s. And then I think a huge amount of their income comes from printer cartridges, which is not glamorous, but it's just an example of how monetization kind of evolved in that company. So I think the main message here is, though, I think you've got to take a look creatively at what assets and IP you have and how this can parlay into some value. And the analogy I would give is you're in a kitchen and you have 3 hours to prepare a gourmet meal with whatever's in the kitchen. I just want to talk about, with that in mind, I just want to talk about two things. One is, what are sectors that I think may not be as great? And I want to emphasize that this is only in the near term. So I don't want to, if anyone on the call is in one of these sectors, it doesn't mean that they're gone forever or anything else. I think they're just more difficult in the short term. So I'm going to talk about sectors which I think are in trouble in the near term, and then also then transition to talking about promising sectors which would be interesting to look at in the near term and beyond. I don't think this would be a surprise to anybody, but airlines and anything related to airlines are tough. The entire hotel and accommodation industry, transportation in general is a tough area. The shared office spaces under the old model of buying real estate and leasing real estate. Restaurants, obviously. The sports area is kind of tough right now, and I'm seeing it from the youth sports area where I'm very involved with my son's lacrosse team, and it's just a big pause right now. I think it's a tough area. And then also traditional brick and mortar colleges and universities are having huge revenue shortfalls tied into sports and tuition and all of these other factors. So the only reason I'm putting this up here is to say I would put the yellow flag up these in the near term, and separately, I want to talk about areas that I think will be interesting going forward. So in terms of interesting sectors for the future and the near term right now, and these are probably obvious to all of you, but online retailing and logistics, I'm sure everybody has had Amazon deliveries in recent times. Home delivery, DoorDash, Grubhub is just really, really thriving now. And obviously any of the cloud collaboration tools like a Zoom or Slack or things like that are doing great. Another big area that continues to grow is just anything involving B2B productivity, and getting more out of the workforce and managing the business. Healthcare, particularly telehealth, is a big area. Cost reduction is a really big area. And Scott Cadora, who's on the call, has a great company in Atlanta that is focused on one form of cost reduction. Pharma is obviously going to be really big because anything related to COVID, this has a myriad of different use cases, but that continues to be big. And then obviously online entertainment, I'm sure everybody has been streaming like crazy in different ways, whether it be Amazon or Netflix or whatever. And then I think it's been very interesting with online education. I think that there are more believers now today in online education than there were 3 months ago. There's been a lot of skepticism over the years, but I think that it's not to say that online education will completely replace brick and mortar, but I think there will be much more openness to using it flexibly. The last area I think that will always be an issue and is very hot is cybersecurity. So my main point of just talking about these is to say, look, here are going to be some really big blue waters, and I think they're worth looking at. If you're already in them, you can go deeper. If you're not in them or have capabilities that could be applied to these, that could be interesting. I'm kind of coming to the close of this so that we can discuss this. But in these times, I think the most important thing is creating time and runway to survive. I think also adapting and pivoting as you can and to do it out of necessity. And really looking at new segments and verticals, which might be interesting. And the last thing is, another option always is to buy or merge with competitors. Let's see. Okay, I think that's it. So I'm sorry, I kind of went through that very quickly, but in summary, I think the key is survive and adapt and look towards interesting areas. So Bill, I think that's the formal part of this, and I want to open it to discussion.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think if anybody wants to kick things off with questions or discussions, let's jump in. If you don't feel comfortable speaking up or you have bad internet connection, feel free to drop a question in the chat and I'll speak for you.
Hi, this is Steve Brooks. I'm a former Duke grad and work in healthcare consulting for medtech startups. My question is, how do you think venture and angel money? How long will it take to come back in? And then over what time period, and how do you think it will roll out? Do you think it'll first be in some sectors and then go back to other sectors? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, what's very interesting is that I'm involved with as an advisor with a healthcare related, I would call it a software platform, and we're in a term sheet negotiation right now, and I think it'll probably close in the next 2 months, and I am seeing deals out there that are closing. This would be for either seed or A. And so I think that one thing that is notable is that there are deals still closing. Um, the one thing I would say, Steve, is that some of these are culminations of processes that it might have started 6 months ago or whatever, where the investor was tracking a company and getting to know it, um, and that was compelling that they wanted to continue with this. But at any rate, I do think that um, it's not going to be the prevailing approach. But I think there are good companies out there that will get funded no matter what. However, in terms of the overall time frame, I think it'll probably let's call it thaw is in another 6 months or thereabouts. And the primary reason, Steve, is just that especially living here in Silicon Valley, the VCs are very mortal and very human. And like all of us, they had vertigo at the speed and the uncertainty of things that had been happening since March here. Um, and so the reaction has been to kind of pause and wait for things to bottom out. And I think that's been kind of the attitude. Um, I think that the reason it'll thaw and money will start to move again will be that it's only a matter of time before a vaccine is announced, for COVID as well as treatments. So I think those things will help emotionally stabilize everybody, that we have a path to that. And then the other thing is that, um, I think as a country we'll endeavor to open up in an orderly way, without having another wave of COVID, and in kind of gradually opening up again. I think that'll start to give signs of life to the economy, which will also give confidence to the venture capitalists. So I think number one, in a number of cases, we are seeing money flow with deals already in hand, but also there'll be more. Um, Terry Terry Burke, I don't know if would you want to comment on this at all? Terry's an expert in this area as well. Terry, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Oh, good. Yeah.
Great. Typical Zoom call, right? So yeah, I agree with what you said, George. I think there's a couple things going on. One, if you look at the data in Q1 that looked still reasonably robust for med tech and life sciences, it is, as George said, those companies were already in flight with venture firms, and it's a pretty important process to get to know the venture funds. I do think we're going to see a slowing of investments. I think I would encourage startups to add time to the overall fundraising timeline, and that could be maybe 4 or 6 months, in part because I think travel will still be somewhat restricted, and venture funds just really like to meet people in person. So if I had to peg a timeline, I would say it's, maybe 4 months, something like that, where it would just slow things down. I think venture funds are being very thoughtful about which investments they want to make, because if it requires a capital call to LPs, it better be for something pretty big. So things with a COVID tailwind, so to speak, kind of bump up the list. So I think, George, you mentioned that as well. And I do think that venture funds are kind of feeding their own portfolio first, and trying to make sure that those survive. I think that was in George's early slides. So it will take time. But I think overall, healthcare is a pretty stable place to be. It's just probably a drawn out timeline is maybe how I would think about it. And then the last comment I would have is, I think you can expect a shift in terms that are much more venture capital favorable. 2019 data was still pretty company friendly in terms of deal structure and terms, and we're already starting to see that shift a little bit. So I don't know, George, if you have thoughts on structure, but I think that there'll be more teeth in favor of investors.
Yeah, those are really great comments, Terry. Incidentally, Terry's a really experienced entrepreneur, executive for large companies as well as a venture capitalist. So she really is knowledgeable. Yeah, in terms of the term sheets that might be out there. So, in Silicon Valley, there's been this very rebellious state for the last maybe 10 or 12 years where entrepreneurs have had the upper hand. And it kind of started with the people from Google and then Facebook, where, there's an attitude that we're not going to let you control the company and we're going to do everything on our terms. And so I think the entrepreneurs and the talent have had the upper hand for the last probably dozen years or thereabouts. Um, and the VCs in general have just kind of gritted their teeth and just done anything to secure what they thought were the most promising deals, whether that be an Uber or WeWork at the time or whatever. They would just grit their teeth and do whatever is necessary to close a deal. And as Tara points out, I think it's shifted now where capital is scarce and the VCs are in the driver's seat because they have the cash. I think that, and two things will shape the term sheets. One is that the sense that valuations should be adjusted downward, and I think it's an emotional thing, which is, if the economy's down, valuations must be down as well. And I think that emotion kind of will color how VCs approach this thing. The other thing is just emotionally that they have the upper hand with the money. I think allows them to be more cautious and methodic as they go through deals. The one thing is that I've seen this in other deals where there's a chemistry between the entrepreneurs and the VCs. And one thing the VCs don't want to do is alienate the companies by offering, too low a valuation or too negative a set of terms. So I think that especially the more seasoned VCs are going to be conscious of, they want alignment of motivation and an emotional alignment with the entrepreneurs. So I don't think they're going to try to just take a scorched earth approach on the deals.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. That's really helpful. And I'm actually seeing exactly what you're describing in, early stage med tech startups. Some who had term sheets all of a sudden got the terms changed and valuation squashed down, more control for the VCs. Other companies that were in diligence and, when they were shopping the original term sheets, those VCs have gone away. So, exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
It's right out there.
What's really funny is that there are only two things that control this. It's fear and greed. And so when there's fear, everyone runs. And then when there's greed, everybody has sharp elbows rushing to the table. We invite other comments and questions.
Yep, and there's one in the chat from Madhavi asking, kind of in crisis situations, obviously innovation moves quickly, partially due to need, partially assisted by some relaxing of rules. What are your thoughts about what, I guess, drives this innovation? Is it more need or kind of opportunity where people see maybe the rules or expectations are a little laxer?
In my own view, what drives innovation is desperation, and quite honestly, if you just if you just look at the Apollo 13 example, the astronauts are 3,000 miles away or whatever, and they're basically going to die if the engineers on the ground don't figure something out. And so they're literally locked in a room for 36 hours. Not leaving, not sleeping, just working through the solution. And I think that's a very good example. And some of the other companies I talked about, Slack would have gone out of business, but somebody said, "Hey, we have this internal communication system. Maybe we can use that and get out there and sell it." And so, and there are many examples though where failure and desperation have led to something. Another one is PayPal, which has been a huge success story. Was actually it was a what we call a cram down, but it was a combination of three failed payment companies. So there are three individual payment companies that were all struggling. And so they combined so they would have some capital together and the talent of the three companies and some of the products. And that eventually became PayPal. But they were actually a failed company at the time.
George, I'm wondering, in your experience with evolution and pivots, this is Chris Wolfington.
Yeah.
What does it look like, in the moment? Like, I imagine there's moments that are serendipitous and then some that are kind of a function of more of a mechanical process. Can you share your experiences or your observations about not reflecting on it, but kind of what it's like? What did it look like when you're in the middle of it?
Well, so it's I think it can be stressful because for all of you who are entrepreneurs in one way or another, um, you're running out of money, and if you're not a Google or a Facebook where you're soaring, your future is uncertain and the clock is ticking, and so it's kind of like being in the fourth quarter of a game where you're behind and you're trying to find a way to turn it around. So it's very stressful. In my most recent company, and so I deal specifically with turnarounds, but my most recent company, I went there in 2014, and the company had been founded in New Zealand. The company was called Northrup, and it originally had a desktop publishing software, which they sold to mostly consumer electronic manufacturers, and was used to publish different types of manuals. The company moved to the US in 2014, roughly, and wanted to adapt this product to offer enterprise-grade content management to the top 100 pharma companies. And that's a huge jump. So the founder moved the company to the US and tried to create an enterprise offering to pharma companies for content management. So the project flopped, and then the company was blacklisted by the pharma industry immediately. And then, so sales went down to nothing. They also ran out of money. And then, so I was brought in at the board in 2015. And so the company had zero cash, and then had been blacklisted in the industry. I'm sure you're wondering why I did this job. And so at any rate, but the reason I did this was, and so on day one, there's no money in the bank account. And also I was getting cancellation notices in my email box on my first day. And I also did say to myself, why did I do this? But the reason I did it was because the company had DNA for a product offering, and it had identified a very interesting marketplace, the farm industry, who could be a huge source of revenues with multi-million-dollar deals, and were willing to pay this. And so the issue was execution. If the company could get it right using its DNA, it could probably make it. So just fast forward, through clawing and kicking and screaming, we raised $25 million over the next 5 years, mostly from the company's original base in New Zealand and Australia. The other thing was we put the product on hold, and then for 2 years rebuilt it completely, and then we relaunched this platform in 2018. The best way to think about the company was we offered the equivalent of Google Docs on a highly nuanced basis to the pharma industry, so a very, very complex product. But anyway, we reissued it in 2018, and we got a group of executives from the top 25 pharma companies to meet with us on a quarterly basis to iterate through the product and discuss it before we launched it. And then when we launched it, within a year, we signed 10 top 10 pharma companies to the product. And the company's doing about 25 million a year now, and break even, maybe slightly profitable. But going back to this, the company had zero money, broken product, blacklisted, and it was kind of stressful at the time. But it's kind of it's an issue of endurance and perseverance and just gutting it out. I don't know if any of you have read the book about Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer, but I think it was in the early 1900s. He led an expedition on a ship to the Antarctic, and within a few months of arriving in the Antarctic, his ship got stuck and frozen in, and then it actually got crushed by the ice. So they had no ship. So they built a camp right on the ice floes. And then one night also a piece of ice broke off with most of their supplies. And so Shackleton spent the next 2 years surviving in the Antarctic, and eventually someone had a longboat where they rowed to, I think it was St. George's Island, which was a few thousand miles away. And anyway, they all got rescued, but he lost his ship and food and everything, and they survived for 2 years, but they just kind of gutted it out and kept going forward. And that's kind of what I think is a good, I don't know, it reminds me a lot of the entrepreneurial path.
Yeah, that feels very true, especially nowadays.
Yeah.
John, it looks like you were going to ask a question or comment.
Yeah, George, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed your story about Apollo 13. To me, that kind of illustrated the dangers of single point of failure. My question is as companies and go through this challenge that we're facing right now, what other dangers do you see that we perhaps need to pay attention to so that we don't face similar situations?
Sure. Well, I think that the I think the biggest danger always is that, and for all of you running companies in one way or another or working at companies, the biggest danger is that everything always takes longer to happen. And what I mean by that is that, the product launch or the service always takes longer to get out there. And secondly, the big deal that you're trying to sign, with your key contact, somehow or another, it always takes longer. The person you're about to sign with gets fired, or they go on vacation, or whatever else, or there's a major announcement by a competitor, which gives you a death blow or something like that. And so I think the most two important things. One is, I think that you have to create as much staying power and survival to keep going, so that you can last through all these dips and other events and delays. So I think staying power and survival and runway are the most important thing, just to keep alive. And the reason is because I said this to one of my executives a few years ago. As long as you stay alive, something good will happen eventually. And so I think that's the most important thing. I think the other thing is that in terms of some of the, let's call it mortality risks for a company by having a single point of failure, I think one of the prescriptions against that is at the very outset and at every juncture, I think you have to keep on studying, what your market opportunity is and the product viability is. So even before you start at the very onset, to keep on analyzing the market viability and the product viability. And at every juncture and every decision, to keep on looking at that and to look for signs in the marketplace or competitors where there's a threat or not. And in the meantime, just keep that runway going, because as long as you have runway, you can always recover.
That makes a lot of sense. And one thing that we've touched on a little bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, George, or anybody else, is not only has the VC market slowed down, but for early stage startups, that kind of sales cycle for customers has probably been elongated as other businesses and organizations and consumers are expanding and trying to figure out, what the next year looks like. What have you been seeing on that front, and kind of what advice do you have for trying to keep deals alive or trying to sign new customers during this time?
Um, well, I mean, quite honestly, it's very tough because, as an example, um, let's say you're selling an enterprise accounting system, which is new and better. It's just much harder to go to a company in this environment and say, you know, you need an accounting system upgrade, as an example. But I think that several things. One is that despite this environment, there are certain industries which are not only unaffected by the environment, but also um, accelerated by the environment. So just to give you an example, you know, people selling COVID equipment, um, you know, it could be a ventilator, mask, or health supplies, anything in the pharma industry. So I think it's a very dichotomous situation. There are certain sectors that I think are going to really do well in the healthcare. Anything saving money, you know, I think would also be very, very attractive. So I think there are a number of sectors. I just want to go back to, yeah. You know, there are any number of sectors that I think are going to do well. So online education is another example where, you know, Coursera and other companies. There's another company that I know really well, Legends of Learning, which is a Duke guy as well. And also anything in online entertainment. So in all these areas, I think that if anything, these things will be accelerated during this time period as opposed to decelerated. Um, and then, as we talked about, some of these other sectors I think are going to be really, really tough in the near term. Um, I would say, though, that depending on what sector you're in, either you'll be in a position where you can accelerate sales and do well. If you're not in one of those sectors, I think you have to be prepared to wait and just keep things simmering and keep going until things revive. And I think survival is the key, and you should expect that it's going to take longer for these things to happen. Incidentally, I would invite a commentary from anybody who has observations on any of these things. So it's not just me taking a Q&A, but if people want to offer any observations about what they're seeing in the environment or the market, you're welcome to comment.
George, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask another question.
Yeah.
And that is, as you've talked about sectors with possible potential and troubled sectors as well, how about looking at it from a regional point of view? And that is thinking about COVID-19 and its impact on regions, and what regions are more likely to withstand or to accelerate post-COVID-19. Do you have any comments in that regard?
Well, at a very macro level, you know, one thing that's interesting is that I think that any companies in North America or Europe who have been doing business with China, I think it's going to be a much different world geographically speaking. As everyone probably has observed, you know, tensions are flaring, and obviously our president is helping that. Anyway, I'll keep this nonpartisan. But anyway, so I think an example is that China. I think there'll be. I just think there'll be less business with China overall, and it's interesting because over the years, with a number of companies, I'd always thought about doing business in China, and it would turn out that you had to have 50% of ownership by someone locally, and then also you had to give them away all your IP and assets and your family jewels and everything. And it didn't seem like a great deal to me, but I think that's kind of being driven home today. But anyway, so I think there'll be less stuff going on in China. I think there will be more activity in you know, places like Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, perhaps even Japan. And then, you know, within North America, I think that I think likely that recovery will actually be fast in the major urban areas. So on the coast, like you know, the accesses of you know, San Francisco and New York, and the reason is just there's so much critical mass there of companies and talent and activity that as we open up slowly, I think they will just naturally take off. I think another big industry that I think that's going to take a long time to recover is oil, which is primarily in the places like Texas and the middle of the country and things like that. And then with Europe, I think it'll also be very concentrated in terms of recovery in the big cities like a London or Paris or something like that. But I would also ask, does anyone have a opinion on that?
Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of, and Madhavi put a comment in the chat, like whether people think there'll be more movement outside of large cities like New York and San Francisco and LA post-crisis. From my personal perspective, I think, probably yes, just because it's so expensive for young people to live there. And I'm very glad that we ended up moving from Brooklyn to North Carolina about 2 months before COVID hit. It saved us from being in a tiny apartment with a small child. And I wonder, as like companies like Twitter and others commit to remote work, whether people are going to feel comfortable moving where the cost of living is cheaper and there's more space.
Yeah, Bill, this is Jen. Yeah, I would add to that, I mean, anecdotally, most people in New York City are talking about staying outside of the city over the next year. But I think the commentary is, I don't want to leave, but I don't see life getting back on track here for the next year. And then I recently received a year-over-year real estate report, and new leases in New York City for residential is down 70% year-over-year. So I think that's an indication, but I think from what I read and hear, there's a willingness to come back, but I just think that this next year is going to be very difficult with people not feeling comfortable convening in densely populated spaces like the subway. And I, like many, are not renewing my WeWork lease, which is a whole other topic. But I think there's a notion too that with a small company like mine, we can work very effectively remotely, and our clients are all over the US. And so it's sort of been interesting to see how even my team adapted, and they're both my two of the guys on my team are just saying, well, why pay New York City rent? And to your point, we can work very effectively together and we'll convene at some point. So anyway, sharing my perspective from New York City anyway.
That's really great, Jen. Yeah, the other thing is that, so I've been doing a lot of remote work for probably the last 10 years because like in my last company, we had offices in Auckland, New Zealand, Seattle, Palo Alto. We had a lot of salespeople on the East Coast of the US, and then we had an Amsterdam office. And so everything I was doing was pretty much remote. And I finally closed our office in Palo Alto. And it's funny because investors would always say, how can you run the company if you're not there? And also what's funny is that the Wall Street Journal, New York Times are having all these articles about this new phenomena called working at home that has just been discovered. And it's like, hello, we've always been doing this in the technology world. And but I think that if you guys remember, about 5 or 6 years ago, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo insisted that everyone work in the office, and she banned working at home.
I remember that.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be movement the other way, because I think people are seeing through this experience that you can work at home very effectively. It's not 100% replacement for being in person, but it can be very effective. The other thing is, it wouldn't happen in Manhattan as much, but if you commute any distance to work, let's say you get up at 7 o'clock, by the time you're in the office and have had several cups of coffee and are sitting down, it's probably 9 o'clock. So it's been a 2-hour lapse from the time you woke up. Whereas when you're working at home, at 7 o'clock, you're having your first cup of coffee and you're online already. And so when I was working at home, the productivity gain was like I could be done with every major thing by 1 o'clock and then do other things. So I think that people are going to be more open to, online working as well. Let's have other comments from people on this.
Yeah, is anyone in Austin or kind of the secondary cities? Like, I guess, Chris, in Boston, it'd be interesting to hear whether those will kind of finally have their moments as people move to some place where there's lots of tech talent and interesting people, but it's cheaper and you can have a backyard.
Well, Boston doesn't qualify as cheaper, but just quickly, I'll share. I was on a call with the Massachusetts Secretary of Transportation, and her department expects that work from home will go from being around 5% for Boston companies to 40%. And I think by comparison, Denver is one of the higher metropolitan areas with work from home, and they're at 10% historically. So I think it's going to be a major shift. And then I was on a call with someone who manages a big team of commercial real estate brokers, and they're expecting that downtown leases will not be renewed, in part because people will be reducing their need for space, but also because if they don't see a need to be downtown, and many don't have that need, then they'll be looking for space in the suburbs. So they think that the landscape in downtown Boston will change dramatically and quickly.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I've heard
Up here in
mention.
LA, I would say we are seeing definitely some benefits of more people working from home, in the sense that, we have the worst traffic in the country, and suddenly things are open and the environment has seen improvements. So I do think companies will rethink what's really necessary to be productive. I agree with George's comments about you get more productive hours in. I think there's just some, what I would say, old school folks who really have a belief in kind of all that face to face. And I think this, a byproduct of COVID is just people are figuring out it's actually possible and it's not as awful as folks perhaps thought. So I think we'll see an increasing trend towards slowing down, coming back to work in person, and spreading out more through remote access.
Yeah, the other thing that we are following, because we do some work in the mobility space, is that for almost safety and security purposes, some of the automakers are actually predicting an increase in auto sales due to the fact that you want to be safe and secure in your own individual environment. So on the one hand, you think, well, fewer people may be moving around, but then we might see a shift in terms of mode of transportation. So that's one interesting point. And then on the commercial real estate point, some at CRE and other real estate commercial owners have talked about the fact that while they're reimagining commercial space, yes, there'll be fewer people in the physical space, but they may need more square feet because of the social distancing, and some of the plans that they're working on are quite interesting. I'm not sure how you convene meetings in that situation if you're all 6 feet apart. I don't know how that all works out. So there's sort of the pluses and minuses of each of the, like if you slice each of the sectors, whether it's auto sales up and down, commercial footprint, up or down. It's, I think it depends on the sector, geography, and your life situation. A lot of parents are not able to work at home with kids at home. So when kids go back to school, that also changes their perspective. So there's that element too, from what I've been reading and hearing.
Yeah, it's interesting because, traditionally, going back in time, this is in medieval times when I was just out of school, but we allotted something like 250 square foot per person in an office, which is huge. And then we've gone the other direction where you can have as little as an average of 50 or even 25 square feet per person, kind of with the Google setup. And then, as you point out, like with COVID, now you have to be apart, and it just completely inverts the setup of the office. And I think it's going to be complicated for a lot of these offices because they're designed in the engineering format, which is you're all sitting on top of each other. and it's not going to be viable for the near term, at least.
You know, George, I heard you say earlier in your presentation, made a reference to a vaccine and treatment for COVID. And I don't know if you were expressing optimism around that, but for what it's worth, and I'm not qualified to have this opinion, but I am generally optimistic that we will evolve and we will develop systems and we will develop, you know, methodologies to manage COVID and whatever comes next. And that all these changes that we're envisioning now won't necessarily be permanent. I'm wondering if anyone else has a view on that.
Yeah, let's open it up for a comment.
Well, I think that it's always healthy to take a worst case planning scenario and go along those lines, because there's no telling on how many years it's going to take before a vaccine is developed. You know, I hope it's within a few months, but I'll believe it when I see it.
So this is Steve Brooks. I worked at FDA. I was a medical officer there and do lectures, and I'm in pharma as well as medical device. And the usual process for testing of a vaccine, it really could be a year to 2 years. And the biology of it is such that the virus is, you know, mutating over time. How much does it mutate? Does it a lot? Does it a little bit? The area you're attacking or sensitizing the body to, is that an area that's conserved? And all this will need to be known. And if we rush something out there under the guise of, you know, it worked preliminarily and it truly does not work, then everybody's out there and they're at risk. If it, you know, if you get it out there and it, you know, and it does work and you get lucky, that's great. You know, maybe you open yourself up to safety risks of the vaccine itself. Anything biologic, you know, doesn't necessarily obey laws of physics. You know, it may not be until you get it into the many thousands of people that you see these, you know, rare responses based on a person's own genotype or phenotype. So, you know, the virus space shot and all that is, it sounds great, but the reality is there's a lot of science and boring testing that needs to be done before we can confidently get something out there. And if that's rushed, that really does expose people, because you may not know for months or years whether what you've got is really working effectively. So it's, I'm cautiously optimistic there. You know, the entire world is, and the best scientists are focused on this, and the big pharma is focused on this because there's big money involved for whoever gets out there first, even second, third, and fourth. The market is just, you know, astronomical. But it's also needs to be approached with caution because of the risks.
Other comments?
Yeah, if we're winding down, you know, we tried to keep this to an hour. So, you know, there is one more question for Stephen, and maybe we'll take that and then wrap up, since we're.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's really interesting what's happening right now. So FDA has been very aggressively pushing digital products, and they realize that, you know, the rate of development is way faster than any single agency with unlimited resources could regulate it. So they've been pushing out for the last 5 years guidelines that are risk-based. So if it's really low risk, you know, they're not even going to regulate it. If it's moderate to severe, based on the amount of risk, they're going to regulate it in different ways. What's most interesting, I was involved with some products that were kind of at home, digital extenders, telehealth, that kind of stuff. This one in particular was an Amazon, it worked on Alexa, and you know, it's a software you download to your Alexa, and it was called CardiaCube. And the idea was, you know, you've been discharged from the hospital, maybe for heart failure, maybe for something else. Doctors and nurses don't have time or resources to reach out to you. And the idea is, if this question answer could ask you questions, and if you responded in a way that went through these algorithms, it would then alert the doc. So it was like a physician extender. You know, great possibility to reduce resources, do a lot of good. But what we learned over and over, big hospital systems, small hospital systems, individual doctors, they just don't have the resources, and they just weren't interested in an expenditure that they didn't have, and it didn't fit in their workflow, and they weren't ready for, and they weren't guaranteed the benefit. And then the other thing that you hear, I was on a great call last week where it was a hospital administrator, was saying, all those products seem really interesting to us before, but it was turning dollars into dimes because there was no reimbursement for this telehealth. Well, what has happened, interestingly, overnight, there are no face-to-face visits. Every single medical office, hospital, et cetera, had to get online and had to do this. And patients love it. The satisfaction ratings are off the chart, and insurers were forced, there's government mandate, they had to reimburse it at 100%. So when this all dies down, and really it could linger for a while, slower hospital visits, now you've got this technology, reimbursement, the companies, the insurers are seeing the value. Will they reimburse it at 20%, 40%, 60%? Nobody really knows, but at least there will be a business model, and it's in the workflow, and there's public acceptance, physician acceptance. So it's a really amazing time to be in anything telemedicine, and all these other startups that had widgets that, could be in the Internet of Things and connected, all of a sudden are pitching COVID, some of it's a stretch, but some of it's real. And so there's a great interest, and all of a sudden, I think when the world rights itself and there's capital again, I think there'll be a business plan and an appetite for this kind of really, really great enabling technology.
That's great, Steve.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, the invitation said we would go to 12:15, and we're right about there. Just want to thank George again for his slides and leading the discussion. This has been hopefully a transformational experience and content that's allowed us to kind of learn, connect a little bit more, and grow as a community. Please look for future emails about the next speakers in the series. I think, Chris, you've organized the next one, so if you want to give a quick plug, I think now's the time.
Great, thanks. So next week we've got Laura Bronner at, I believe, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And she, within the last 5 months, went from bumping up against not making payroll to then having to shut down for COVID. She runs a network of startup dental practices, and they spent the last 6 weeks putting together their plan to reopen, which are now getting ready to implement. So anyway, she's going to be sharing from that experience and just kind of looking to stimulate some dialogue, mostly around the notion of pivoting and actually turning ideas into a specific plan that you can execute on, is my interpretation of it. So there'll be an email going out around that to sign up. If for some reason you don't get it or have more curiosity about it, please let me or Bill or anyone else Jen or Terry, who's connected. And then we're also looking to fill the pipeline. We want to try and do one of these each week until we can't find any more. So we've got a system set up now, and you can execute on setting these up pretty easily now. So if you're interested in doing something, or if you know someone who would be a good host, please let us know.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks again, George, and everybody for joining and participating in this discussion. We hope to see you at plenty of these future sessions.
Great.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.